The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Recording now. All right.
Pat and I had an interesting conversation yesterday off the air that I wanted to bring Rachel into today, which was that Pat mentioned that growing up, there was not really that much political discussion within his family, to the degree, Pat, that very often you wouldn't even know for sure who your parents were necessarily voting for.
Yeah, they had this opinion that who you're voting for is something more personal and maybe shouldn't be discussed. But from what I've seen and the conversations that we have had, they're far more conservative than I am, and even have questions as to why I'm on the show.
It's weird to me because growing up in, a progressive Jewish immigrant family, I mean, in Argentina, political discussion is sort of like what families do. It's sort of what friends do. In many Jewish families, political discussion is like sort of what is done. So when I tell people, I've kind of been following the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for 20 years, and they say, wait, hold on a second, how could that be? Based on your age, how could you possibly? And I say, no, since I was 10 or 12 years old, I was exposed to very specific conversations about that, about election issues, about so much. And for me, it's very difficult to imagine not just having completely clear and full, who are you voting for? Why are you voting for them? When will I get to vote? And do I have to vote the way you vote? And why do you vote that way? What was your sort of family situation as far as political discussion?
I mean, it was pretty similar to yours, I would say, kind of along the lines of a progressive, Jewish, liberal family and town.
Yeah.
And so I think kind of the nature around those topics it was very open. It was definitely an open line of communication. I think my sister and myself are both a little bit more liberal than my parents, although they are liberal.
Common.
Yeah, of course, with age, definitely. But I think the conversation was very open. I feel like I learned about it from a young age, and I always was definitely kind of entrenched in an area where we would not necessarily attacking Republicans, but just kind of more positivity towards the left.
Pat, would you say that, in other words, let me put it a different way. Did you ever have curiosity where you just wanted to say to your dad, so exactly who are you voting for? And did you not because you thought you gleaned that it was an inappropriate question, or did you genuinely just not ever think of asking that?
I think I would bring it up, and that was what his response was.
Oh,
that's
personal.
More of a personal thing. Well, for him, he's a retired cop. He's more of a stoic guy, so I can see how he wouldn't want to share that. I mean, sometimes politics and religion are considered taboo in some circles, but you'd think that amongst your family, you'd be able to talk about that sort of thing.
I would say so. Do you think it's changed over time? Like, has this gotten more difficult, more closed off, or more open over time, or has it just been the same?
We will talk about politics for a bit. I mean, he's willing to criticize like the Obama administration or Hillary's campaign, but when you try to project the attacks onto the people that he supports, he's just not having any of it.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I think the more interesting discussion, at least amongst my family, because we were all pretty similar ideologically, not necessarily in terms of voting. I voted for Bernie. My sister voted for Bernie. My parents voted for Hillary. However, what was more interesting to me is kind of across lines in terms of aunts and uncles and cousins, because I'm not going to point anyone out in case any of my family members are watching, but there are definitely members who I won't say by name who are conservative. And it's interesting also, again, liberal, Jewish, Newton, close by town, but it's really interesting to kind of see these kind of diametrically opposed opinions amongst a family.
See, in my family, everybody's basically liberal. Everybody's left, right? So my family that's in Argentina, my family that's in Israel, my family that's in France, everybody is liberal. But there are sort of more disagreements because in South America, there are way more sort of legitimate factions of the left. So there are way more debates to be had within the left. And if you look at some of the different political parties, and South America is infamous for having sort of like the corrupt strong arm left and the more socialist left and these different, the moderate left, et cetera, that there were still significant disagreements. But in the US, everybody would be very, very liberal, which is sort of interesting. I don't know if there's like a shades of gray in your family, Pat.
No, we're very just wrapped up in the dichotomy of American politics where it's one way or the other. Yeah. It's interesting because I have a mom and stepdad, a dad and stepmom. And out of the four of them, I probably agree with my stepmom the most. and even she is not willing to vote for Hillary Clinton.
I actually kind of disagree with both of you because I feel like there is a difference between the younger liberals and the older liberals, even within families, and that is mainly just about the economy. Because as you get older, it's very common you become a little bit more conservative about your money. So that's, I don't know.
That isn't true.
Yeah.
I think that's confusing because if you survey people and split the results up by age bracket, at any given time, the older people are more fiscally conservative than the younger people, but there isn't evidence that they become more conservative as they age. It's more that just each subsequently younger generation is and remains more liberal to begin with. So I think that there's certainly more to look at there. The last thing I wanted to touch on with you, Pat, was is there confusion about you being on a progressive show?
No, they're just not always willing to watch it, I would say.
Oh, okay.
They would rather just turn it off, and they're happy for me. They're happy that I have a job, but they're not too interested in watching.
They're happy Pat's out of the house, but they'd rather it be working for Rush Limbaugh.
That's correct. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, well, I'm sure we will hear from I know there's people in the audience who have basically no political conversation with their parents at all. Like it is not discussed. And then there are, as I punch my mic, there are probably people who are more in a situation like I was growing up where it's just like, oh yeah, of course you would talk about that. Okay, let's move on. Rachel, let's start with the story about Americans and pet spending. And I have some thoughts on this.
Sure. So there's a working paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research that recently was comparing rising healthcare costs among humans, I guess that's the best way to say it, and their pets. So even though only roughly about 1% of pets have health insurance, and their type of insurance is definitely subject to less government regulation, there were definitely similarities amongst the two groups, which I think is really interesting to get into. So one finding was the rapid growth in spending. It was from between about 1996 to 2012, when spending as a share of GDP for entertainment and housing was fairly flat. Spending for health increased, I think, for about 60% for pets and about 50% for people. And when I keep saying for pets, we have to remember it's not a dog going in and paying for itself. It's the human paying for their pet.
Right. Because pets are property by law.
Right. So during roughly that same time period, the amount of physicians also grew by 40%, and it nearly doubled for vets. And there was an end of life spike in spending, which I also thought was really interesting. And they compared a group of humans with lymphoma and dogs with lymphoma, and they found that the humans' healthcare spending was about more than twice it was during a regular period, and for dogs, it was nearly 3.5 times higher. So a question that kind of comes up for me, does increased spending have to do with an increasing view that pets are family members? And I also think it's really important to kind of note here, again, this is not an apples to apples comparison.
Right.
It's pretty I mean, the information is definitely interesting to see that when, even though it's maybe not correlational, it's definitely interesting to look at. However, I'm trying to kind of remind myself that this comparison, it's not the same.
Well, I think that there's two factors potentially at play. One is, yes, the sort of cultural development of the pet, particularly dogs and cats in the United States, probably does lead to people being more willing to spend more money on health care for their pets, very generally speaking. But I think there's another angle as well, which is that there's a phenomena called price anchoring, where we compare the prices of certain things to the prices of other things. And even though we might say on paper, healthcare spending on ourselves and our families is totally separate from healthcare spending on animals that we own, I think it stands to reason that as the price of healthcare for humans goes up, comparatively, in our minds, the percentage of that seems reasonable to spend on pets probably also goes up to some degree, right? I mean, if you were used to spending $100 a year, $100 a month on your health insurance premium, for example, spending $100 a month on your dog might seem like a lot. But if now your family health insurance is $500 a month, all of a sudden increasing your spending on your dog from $40 to $100 a month might seem comparatively reasonable. I don't know. I mean, Pat, do you have a sense? I think that both of those factors are at play.
That's definitely it. I mean, people are willing to spend so much money on their pets for accessories, and this is something as important as their own life, extending their life, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense.
But I also don't really believe in the blame game. It's kind of saying, oh, we can blame all these large costs on government and on insurance because it's less prevalent in the healthcare sector.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
right.
I don't think that's a fair comparison. I don't buy that.
In other words, the cost of health insurance spending has gone up in great part because just premiums are up, expenditures are up, it's more expensive, and part of it is what is going on with government administration. You can't make the same argument with with pet spending. I think that strengthens the argument that it's cultural.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting angle. I guess it could strengthen it that it's cultural, but I don't think it's fair to say that, because this isn't happening amongst the pet healthcare, that we can totally put the blame there just because it's not happening in this other area.
Do you have pets right now?
I used to have a gerbil. Her name was Honey. She passed away about a decade ago.
I'm sorry to hear that.
I've wanted a pug my entire life, but I was not allowed to get one because of building regulations.
Okay, well, that can be tough in Boston. Pat, what about you?
I have a cat. Her name is Miss Muffet.
Okay.
And she's more of a rescue, so we don't know how old she is. And she's an outdoor cat, and sometimes she'll get stuck in buildings, and we can't even find her for weeks on end.
And do you worry when the cat is gone for weeks?
Yeah, but she always shows back up.
Wow.
I mean, she's pretty resilient. She's had a bunch of different troubles in her past.
I know I have a neighbor who has an outdoor cat, and I often see the cat looks horrified. The cat is making a noise that I can't replicate, which seems like it's very much afraid. It's trying to get inside, and the neighbor says, don't let the cat in to the building. We'll let the cat in when we determine it's inside time. I don't think they have any idea the distress level that this cat is experiencing as an outdoor cat. Then my neighbor says, great outdoor cat. She really has become a very good outdoor cat. And I'm like, the cat is just crowded up against the door, wishing for somebody who lives in the building to let the cat in. I don't know how you can tell if it's a good outdoor cat.
Yeah, I think that's the only type of pet I would want to have going forward. You can just kind of let him out and not even worry about him. But it's too bad you're not willing to give an impression, because those always seem to go over well.
I mean, I can't even replicate it. It's like sort of a screeching. I don't know how else to...
Just try.
It's like a... something like that.
Yeah, I'm not much of a cat person myself, but I appreciate your impersonation of one.
I'm a dog person myself.
Me too.
All right, we've been talking about jobs that are automatable in the future, and there's something interesting that turned up about surveillance and security and technology.
Okay. One of Japan's IT providers, NEC Corporation, has built an AI that can search CCTV footage to spot unwanted criminals and missing children and suspicious activity. And it can spot specific faces in about 10 seconds through 1 million individual instances of facial data. So the system is called NeoFace Image Data Mining, and the code can identify when a particular individual appears at a certain time or with others. So the goal is essentially to help investigators spot criminals very rapidly. So the system uses tree-shaped data management, which in computer science is an abstract data type, and it ranks camera-captured faces by similarity. So the more data it scans, the better it becomes at recognition, because it improves itself and adds images to the database. It's also recently seen that China is getting involved with their company called Hikvision Processing Unit, which uses deep neural networks and a set of algorithms to scan images for suspicious activity, and that's at a 99% accuracy. So there's definitely a lot of huge gains I can see here in terms of if you need to kind of rapidly scan tons and tons and tons of video data, automating that is definitely really, really important, and kind of thinking about that in terms of data. When you need to scan tons and tons and tons of data, automating it is definitely the best way to do that. But I think it's also really interesting because it brings up a lot of issues about privacy, because if you're near a criminal and then you're scanned, what happens if your face gets kind of put in the throes of everything?
Well, I assume at some point a human gets involved, but I think the sort of layer of this was at a certain point before public CCTV cameras, you needed individual people, right? The coroner officer or whatever to actually look. And as we've seen more and more public security cameras and CCTV cameras start to crop up, you could have a human who's just in a room with a bunch of screens looking at what each camera sees. And then now we're sort of seeing the next level, which is actually, for some functions, you don't even really need the security supervisor in the room looking at the cameras, because the computer AI can sort of look through the cameras much more quickly and much more efficiently, at least for certain specific people that it's looking for, than can a human. So I think that this is, for me, the privacy thing. If you're in public or in a building where there are security cameras, whether it's an AI or a person in a room looking through to see who it is, I think in either way, it's a very similar situation legally and in terms of privacy. But I am, again, caught in the undeniable reality that more areas than what we assume are automatable and more jobs than what we are thinking of are replaceable with technology. I don't think, Pat, we even have a sense of the extent to which jobs can be replaced with technology.
Right, and if you look at crimes too, I mean, the first 48 hours of a crime is when you're most likely to catch the person.
Yeah.
So if security cameras can be enhanced to make finding that person easier, that's a lot better. And I think too, you kind of give up your right to privacy when you're out in public for the most part.
There is no inherent right to privacy in public, and where this can sort of become dicey is, well, if someone's standing in public and you've left the blinds open in your window and someone is from outside filming inside, there can be these sort of more dubious situations where you can make a different case, but that's not at all sort of what we're talking about here. I think that there's also something to be said here for the reality that different countries have different approaches to what we might colloquially call a police state, and that there are countries, particularly when you look at a country like Singapore, where the entire relationship of people to law enforcement and what the rules are is just very different than in the United States, which I would argue has a much more significantly, compared to Singapore anyway, laissez-faire attitude. And I think that will also be a factor in terms of how these technologies are actually used by different countries. We'll know what's the max they can do, and how countries use them will probably vary.
Yeah, I mean, I think in machine vision, facial recognition is a huge field because it opens up opportunities like this. And it's really interesting because if you're also kind of thinking about, okay, what about maybe if we're trying to scan something for an object recognition? But the issue is that kind of creating a model for that is really, really difficult because the amount of ways that a object or a human can change or move in a scene is limitless. So that's why it's really hard to come up with these models.
Very, very interesting stuff. Fascinating what's going on. And always the question, will it be used for, this is sort of a fake black and white way of looking at it, but will it be used for good or evil? Usually the answer is sort of somewhere in between, depending on how your moral compass is adjusted on that particular day, I guess. Keep getting the calendars. We are offering them at davidpakman.com/calendar17. Remember that members can use the discount code membercalendar17. That will give you a 30% discount off the calendar if you are a member, and a lot of members are already taking advantage of that.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.